On the morning of July 16, 1990, 15-year-old Robert Pillsen-Rahier called his mom, Jean Rahier-Langness, from the Cheyenne Mesa treatment center where he'd been only a few weeks. On this call, he hinted that something was wrong, but told her he couldn't tell her over the phone because their call was being monitored. Jean had every intention of making it to the treatment center to speak to him, but just hours later, she would receive a call saying that Robert had run away. In the following weeks and months, it would become obvious that Cheyenne Mesa's version of what happened just didn't make sense. And sadly, Robert has never been brought home, but his family has never stopped looking for answers. Hello everyone, I'm Victoria, and thank you for joining me for this video on Robert Pillsen-Rahier. His story is another one that just makes me so mad because I feel like it was so obvious that things weren't adding up and that the stories that were being told just didn't make sense, and yet the police really didn't do anything about it, and he's still missing to this day. This video includes discussion of child abuse, sexual abuse, depression, self-harm, and suicide. If any of these feel like something you feel uncomfortable hearing about at this time, please stop watching, and I hope to see you in another video. Robert, who also goes by Bobby, was born to his mother Jean and his father, Robert Thomas Pillsen Sr., on October 27, 1974. Sadly, Robert Sr. passed away at only 33 years old. I don't know if him and Jean were still together or how he died, but obviously this was very traumatic for both Jean and Robert, who was so young. And when Bobby was 4 years old, Jean would get remarried to a man named Gerald Rahier. And Gerald and Bobby, they absolutely loved each other. Gerald gladly and proudly took on the role of father to Bobby, and that led him to adopt Bobby. And because Robert had lost his father so early in his life, Gerald was really the only father figure he ever knew. Gerald was a veteran, and he'd suffered a pretty severe injury during his time overseas. Gerald had been commissioned in the U.S. Army, and he served as an air traffic controller. One day, while in Vietnam, Gerald was inside the non-commissioned officers club, and on this day, a Viet Cong group bombarded this building. In this attack, Gerald was hit by shrapnel, and sadly, his spinal cord was severed. And though Gerald was given a Purple Heart for his service and sacrifice, this injury left him paraplegic and in a wheelchair. Despite his disability, though, Gerald did all he could with Bobby. He taught Bobby how to ride a bike and many other outdoor skills. Gerald had always been an avid outdoorsman, and so they were able to bond through those activities. Jean and Gerald had a second son together, whom they named Gerald Jr., and Robert was really happy to have a little brother. They all seemed to get along, and they were a happy family. And as I'm sure we all know, just because someone is a good parent, a good spouse, friend, worker, person, everything, doesn't mean they can't be struggling. We also know that veterans do statistically suffer from mental health issues more often, and men can disproportionately suffer through depression and other mental health issues in silence. Unfortunately, this was true for Gerald, who was suffering from severe depression and PTSD. In 1982, Jean and Gerald decided to move to a new home. I don't know what prompted this decision, but they began the process of packing up their home and moving into this new home that wasn't very far away from the home they'd previously been living in. Moving is stressful for anyone, and this is even more true with two young kids running around. Due to his disability, Gerald wasn't able to help with many of the moving tasks that day. Obviously, moving is a very labor-intensive process, and trust me, I have moved way too many times to not know exactly how labor-intensive it can be. I mean, you have to pack up all your boxes, carry them out to the moving van, load up the moving van, drive the moving van, unpack everything, clean. It's just this never-ending cycle of having to do something or lift something heavy or move something over and over and over again. It's all a super physical, very labor-heavy process. Because Gerald understandably couldn't do all of this, a couple who were friends of Jean and Gerald came over to help with the move that day. According to Jean's recollection, this day was rough and absolutely chaotic. Robert, who was only 7 at the time, wasn't listening well and just continued to act out, as children do. Gerald Sr. was really struggling with not being able to help, so much so that it began to make him angry. Gene explained that he hated seeing another family do what he felt he should be able to do for his family and his home. Though his family didn't care about his disabilities, obviously this is a massive change. This man had been strong, an avid outdoorsman, a really proud provider, and now he couldn't even help his family move. And I'm sure that's something that would weigh on anyone's mental health. I mean, that's a huge change to go from this very active, strong person to someone who now, really isn't even able to do things on their own anymore. Between being mad at his own physical limitations, struggling with his mental health for a while already, and the absolute chaos of the day, Gerald was in a really bad place. As the day progressed, Gene decided to take Gerald Jr. and Robert over to the new house to start some unpacking, and Gerald Sr. would stay behind at the old house. Gene called Gerald after they'd been at the new house for a while to check in with him, and he didn't answer. And when Gene couldn't get a hold of Gerald, obviously she was really worried. Not only was he there alone for part of the time, it seems, but he would have these really violent muscle spasms, and so she was worried that somehow he may have fallen out of his chair and been stuck somewhere and needing help and unable to get to a phone. She recognized the need to check on him, so she loaded up the boys into the van and then quickly went back over to their old house that they were moving out of. When they arrived at the house, Robert ran inside while Gene was getting Gerald Jr. out of the car. Very quickly, Bobby came running back out of the house, now completely pale, and he said to her, "Mom, Dad is all covered in blood." Gene quickly rushed into the home and sadly found that what Bobby said was true. She found Gerald laying there completely covered in blood, dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. I can't imagine how horrible finding this scene would be at any age, but at 7? At 7, you're old enough to have some concept of what's going on and remember what happened after that, to be able to hold on to that memory. And that's horrifying that that's what little Bobby ran in on. And I just can't imagine what he must have been feeling. I can't imagine how the whole family must have been feeling seeing this, because Gene had to see it too. After finding his father dead, Robert was traumatized, as anyone would be. Given his young age and the trauma he just experienced, Robert began to very much struggle with his emotions. He really withdrew into himself, seeming to lose some of his happiness and that childlikeness of his personality. And Jean really tried to support him in any way she could, as she herself began to struggle with this transition of being a single mother to 2 young boys. And she was doing the best she could given the fact that she was grieving herself, but she recognized that Robert had truly witnessed something horrific for a child to witness, and she was determined to do everything she could to help him. With time, Robert developed trauma-related learning disabilities, and he was moved into special education classes to support him. He'd been in these classes for a while, and in 1986, Bobby went to his mother to confide in some of the things that had been going on in these classes. Apparently, there were times when, instead of actually dealing with his emotions and some of what he was going through, to force him to behave, the teachers were handcuffing Robert to the chair that he was sitting in so that he couldn't get up and disrupt anything. Jean, obviously horrified. I don't even have kids yet, and I cannot imagine how livid I would be if I heard this. I can't even fathom how I would react. I just know it would be horrible. I would probably be going to jail. So livid. I'd be so mad. And so obviously, Jean pulled Robert out of school right then and there. Absolutely not. They were not going to be doing that to him anymore. She took him right out of the class, right out of school. And shortly after that, she made the arrangements that their little family would move to Colorado. I'm not sure exactly what drew them to Colorado, but I'm sure that there was hope that a change of scenery and a new place could give them a fresh start. They settled in the Colorado Springs area, and it would be a few more years before the next big thing happened. In 1989, Jean entered the now 15-year-old Robert's bedroom and found him crying and holding a razor blade. Jean, realizing how dire the situation had become, was finally able to get Bobby to confide in her, and he told her that he felt and had always felt that his father's suicide was his own fault. He said that he'd been acting out that day, and he thought that he was what finally tipped his father over the edge and made him take his own life. And oh my gosh, when I read that during my research, it made me want to sob. I just want to wrap that sweet little boy up in my arms and tell him that it's not his fault. It could never be his fault. And that's heartbreaking that this young boy for the past 8 years has felt that it was his fault that his dad committed suicide. And on the other side of it, I can't imagine how devastating that would be for Jean to hear. She really had been doing her best to support him and get him the help he needed for years. And to figure out that he'd been struggling with this feeling of guilt the whole time, I'm sure it was just heartbreaking and overwhelming. And my heart just breaks for their whole family. It really is just all around an awful situation. Jean did her best to explain to Robert that it wasn't his fault, nor had it ever been his fault. She told him about the things that he may not have known or remembered from when he was 7. There's some things that, you don't really need to clue your kids in on, because why are you going to add to their stress when, you're trying to deal with things on your own? It's one thing to healthily express emotions, but explaining to your 7-year-old the intricacies of PTSD caused by, Vietnam War combat, which we all know historically was very brutal. It's just not something you need to explain to a 7-year-old. And I'm sure he didn't know these things. She explained to Bobby that Gerald had many health issues, physical, emotional, mental, all of these things that added up and made his life hard. Aside from his physical disabilities and the side effects of the paralysis, when people suffer from these issues, usually there's things that come with it. It's not just that they are paraplegic now, but like she mentioned, they have muscle spasms. There's a lot of pain that can come with that. Just constant issues that can come up. And on top of that, he suffered from PTSD and depression at the same time. And why would 7-year-old Bobby know that? Or even maybe he just didn't remember a lot of it. But now that Jean knew how bad Bobby's mental state had become, she immediately got him into therapy. I'm sure we all know, though, that therapy does not immediately fix years of trauma, depression, and negative self-talk. So despite her quick action, it was around this time that Bobby began to get into trouble at his new school. Given everything that Bobby was going through and struggling with, I'm sure it is no surprise to anyone that he was being bullied, because kids really do suck sometimes. And because of this bullying that was happening all the time and Bobby's own emotional struggles, there was a day when a kid was harassing him at school, and Bobby punched them in the face. Obviously, this punch led to a full-blown fight, and one of those punches actually did end up breaking the kid's glasses as well. I don't know how hurt either of them were, but they did get into a fight. And honestly, good for Bobby. Sounds like the kid probably had it coming. After this incident, obviously the school wasn't happy with Robert, and Jean made the decision that Robert would be admitted into a more intensive treatment facility to help him with everything that was going on. He was sent to the Cheyenne Mesa Adolescent Treatment Facility, where the center was focused on treating teenagers with psychiatric and behavioral problems. Robert stayed at this treatment facility for a few months before he came home. Robert would stay at this facility for a few months before he was discharged and sent home. And I'm not completely sure what the criteria was for when Bobby could be sent back. I don't know if he had to just check certain boxes off, or if it was more of he was just planning to stay there for a certain period of time because it was almost like critical care, okay, he's really struggling, so we'll take him for 2 months and then we'll send him home and see how he's doing. I obviously don't know what the treatment plan was, but When Bobby came back, he really was not in a good place. Really doesn't seem like he was any better equipped to deal with the emotions that came up, or like he was even in a better emotional state whenever they sent him back. And because of this, not only did the behavioral issues continue when he came back, they got worse. I don't know many details about exactly how his behavior got worse, but I do know that at one point this all accumulated to Robert running away from his mother's home, though he did come back shortly thereafter. However he was acting out, it seems like the authorities had been involved to a certain point, because finally there was a day when Bobby was acting out again that the police brought him home to his mom, and they were sick of him acting out. They told Jean that if she didn't put him in a long-term care facility, they were going to remove him from her custody. And this is why I have to be honest, I have so many more questions about Bobby's behavior. I would say, based on just what I know, it feels like way too much of an overreaction, so I'm going to lean to the side of we're missing context, although we do know in the 80s and 90s that police obviously had zero understanding about mental health. They actually don't really have a lot of understanding about mental health today. So maybe they were just like, this kid keeps getting into trouble and we hate it, put him on, like, get rid of him. If you don't, we will. Like, and yeah, so just feels like there's so much missing. Like, what is happening? Why are they so upset about this? With this threat now looming over her head, Jean again sought the help of the Cheyenne Mesa Adolescent Treatment Facility. And in June of 1990, a very unhappy Robert went back. See, Jean knew that he didn't really like this facility. She knew he was very unhappy going, and she hadn't wanted to send him back. She wasn't happy with him going either. But given what the police had told her, she felt like she really didn't have a choice at this time. Being the supportive, loving mother she was, Jean spoke to Bobby every day on the phone and brought him home on the weekends when she was able. On the morning of July 6, 1990, Bobby called Jean on the phone just like they did every day. But this was very much unlike any of the other calls they had. Bobby was crying and told his mom he really needed to talk to her. Jean immediately asked what was wrong and assured Bobby that he could tell her anything he needed to. Robert refused to tell her anything other than that he needed to talk to her in person because, as he would warn her, the facility monitored the phone calls and would be listening. This whole situation just gives me the heebie-jeebies. Like, I understand needing to monitor some kids to an extent, especially if they are on some sort of suicide watch or something like that, but they aren't prisoners. They should be afforded some sort of privacy, at least occasionally, you'd think. At least if you confirmed they were calling their parents or something, you'd think you'd give them some sort of privacy, that they would be afforded that. My heart clenched when I read that he was like, no, I can't tell you over the phone. You have to come here so I can tell you. Because that never bodes well. Especially if they're listening. There's some sort of secret and he knows they're listening to the calls and he's telling his mom that he's going to tell her the secret. That's just terrifying. Please, 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 do not hang on to scary secrets if you have them. I'm serious. I don't care who you have to tell, but tell someone. Scary secrets are the secrets that get you killed. And those are the ones that we hear about time and time again in true crime cases, that they needed that person to come see them immediately, or they were on their way to see them because they had some big secret that they couldn't tell, and then they disappeared before they could tell the secret. It can be embarrassing sometimes to talk about these secrets that we have, and obviously that's why it's a secret. But it's more important to let people know what's going on with you, especially if you feel you may be in danger, because it is dangerous to hold on to those secrets and not let anyone know what's going on. Bobby did also imply to Jean that whatever this big secret was, it was making him want to run away from the facility. But Jean made him promise that he would stay put because she was going to come that very day to talk to him. And Jean was on top of this. As soon as they hung up, she called Cheyenne Mesa and told them she was going to come that very day to talk to her son. But the facility told her that she couldn't come today. That wasn't allowed. She wouldn't be able to talk to him. And why couldn't she see him? Well, they told her that Bobby was going on a one-day field trip that day, and she wouldn't be able to see him. Confused, but trying to follow the rules, Jean agreed to wait until Robert came back from the field trip that day, but made it known she was still coming back that very day. So she told the staff at Cheyenne Mesa that she needed to be informed as soon as her son was back. And a few hours later, she did receive a call back from Cheyenne Mesa, just not the one she ever expected to get. The facility was calling to let her know that Robert was gone. He'd run away. Jean went straight to the facility to speak with the personnel and the authorities who had been called. The authorities started by sharing with her that they hadn't been able to find any signs of Robert around the facility. The story provided by the facility was this. One staff member saw Robert laying in the middle of a field on the property at about 8:45 that morning. And another staff member claimed that they saw Robert sneaking off of the property shortly after, but near that same time. And the staff members told Jean and the authorities that they knew what he'd been wearing that day: a blue plaid shirt and black jeans. And though police were pretty quick to accept this runaway story, Jean was very quick to point out the issues with what they were saying. So you remember how I said that Bobby had called Jean that morning? Yeah, she was on the phone with him at 8:45 that morning, and they hadn't hung up until well after that time. She also wanted to know why, if this staff member had seen Bobby sneaking off the property, why hadn't they stopped him? And the staff member's excuse was something like, well, he was a big kid. It would have been too hard to stop him. And I mean, maybe Bobby could have been considered a bigger kid for his age. He was 5'9" and 180 pounds. But I would like to think that facilities like this would have protocols in place for this exact situation. Like, y'all are supposed to be dealing with the troubled youth of this area, and y'all don't have a runaway protocol in place? And another very disturbing thing said by a member of the staff at this facility was that literally during questioning on the very first day, within hours of Bobby going missing, a staff member said, maybe Bobby didn't make it. Maybe he's dead. Excuse me, what? Why would... The kid ran away like 3 hours ago. What do you mean? Maybe he didn't make it. What didn't he make it away from? Excuse me? Now, I don't believe Jean was told about this statement on that very day, but she was told about it later on when talking to authorities about Bobby's disappearance. And sadly, Bobby wasn't found that first day. Jean had to go home without knowing where her oldest son was. She called Cheyenne Mesa the next day to see if Robert had come back or if they'd seen any sign of him. They hadn't, and they hung up on her. She called the next day, no update. He wasn't back. And she called on the next day, the third day since Bobby had been missing, and asked about if there were any updates on her 15-year-old son, who, you know, had supposedly run away from the very facility she was talking to. And despite the fact that they lost her son under their ever so watchful eye and, you know, professionalism, told Jean that they were tired of her calling. That's what Cheyenne Mesa told her. They were tired of her calling. They'd had enough of her calling. And in fact, if she didn't stop calling, they would contact the authorities and have her charged with harassment. Jean was obviously shocked and horrified. Her son had only gone missing 3 days before. And not only were they the ones who let him run off while someone watched it happen, apparently, but they also, I mean, Robert could still be in the area. If he actually run away, like they said he did, then he could still be found. He could still be in the area. So why are they shutting her down immediately and threatening to have her arrested? You would think that hearing that, the police would have been like, oh, what? We should look at the end of them. Excuse me? Like, you would think that that would stand out as a huge, waving, flaming red flag to authorities, but they never seemed to really look into Cheyenne Mesa and any of the people working there. As a matter of fact, it doesn't seem like they ever really looked into any theory other than Robert running away, and on top of that, they didn't really even look for Robert. Jean couldn't get past that this just didn't make sense to her. She could admit that Robert had run away before, but he had always come back. Or surely if he had run away from the facility, why wouldn't he have called her or come home eventually? If he was getting away from them, surely he could come back to her, right? She really wished she knew what Bobby had been trying to tell her that morning, and she made it her mission to try to figure it out. One thing Jean remembered was that in the weekend visit just before Bobby had gone missing, while she was doing his laundry, she noticed a little bit of blood in a pair of his underwear. Though immediately it hadn't stuck out to her as something to worry about, obviously it wasn't a large amount of blood, she now wondered if this could point to something more sinister, and if there was a possibility that Bobby had been being sexually abused by some of the counselors or maybe even other kids at Cheyenne Mesa, and maybe that's what he was trying to tell her. So if we just pause right here for a second, given all the information, despite how sketchy the staff looks, because Lord knows they do, I could understand if it was, understand is not the right word there, that's why I kind of cut myself off. I could see the possibility that Robert may have run away if he was facing some sort of abuse or sexual abuse at this facility. I could see that maybe, despite promising his mother he wouldn't, maybe something happened, maybe someone was coming after him, and he just left to get away in that moment. Maybe the staff had just been a little bit confused about the time they thought he'd run away that morning, and maybe Robert hadn't come home to her yet because Jean had been forced to send him away before. So what if the police came back and said, no, you're sending him back, and he was put in this position of feeling like, you know, he wasn't, no matter how much his mom loved him and wanted to take care of him, she couldn't. Maybe she wouldn't have a choice. But as my research progressed and as time progressed in the actual case, more information came out that made it seem like something much more ominous did happen to Bobby, and has completely convinced me that there's no chance that he ran away from that facility. To begin with, as the weeks went by, there were absolutely no sightings, nor was there any word from Bobby whatsoever. He was 15 with no money and no outside connections except for his mother, so where on earth would he have gone, and how could he have stayed gone for so long? The next big thing that happened was a few weeks after Bobby disappeared, Jean received a package of his things from Cheyenne Mesa. This package contained all of the belongings that Robert had left behind at Cheyenne Mesa when he'd run away. First was both pairs of shoes that Bobby had been sent to Cheyenne Mesa with. So that meant he'd run away barefoot? Jean shared that Bobby had extremely sensitive feet. He hated walking anywhere barefoot, and he definitely wasn't going to go roaming around outside without shoes on, let alone actually run away. And as if that wasn't bad enough, as she continued looking through the package, she found the exact outfit that Robert was supposedly wearing the day that he ran away. In her hands were the blue plaid t-shirt and the black pair of jeans that he owned. And I have to say, that's a pretty specific outfit description that the facility had provided. It wasn't like they were like, oh, I think he was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. They were like, no, blue plaid shirt and black jeans. If they had given a more vague answer, it would have been like out of the question. I mean, we wouldn't have known, but that's a really specific answer to then pull this clothing out and then be like, oh yeah, it's right here. Finding all of this was obviously super confusing and extremely distressing to Jean. I think the most horrifying thing about this is that after Jean brought everything to the police and laid it all out in front of them, laid all of the details and the evidence out in front of them, the staff story didn't make sense. Both of Bobby's shoes were right here in her possession. The exact outfit that he wore supposedly when he ran away from the facility. The fact that on the very morning that he supposedly ran away, he'd called her to tell her that there was some terrible secret he needed to tell her, but that it was so important that he needed to tell her in person where the staff couldn't hear. She even made sure to mention the small bit of blood she'd found in his underwear and what that could possibly mean. And yet, even with all of this laid out right there in front of them, you know, point after point with all the evidence, the police still classify this as a runaway case, which means that, from what I can tell, they basically didn't investigate. They didn't look for Bobby, and his case very rapidly went cold, even though his mom and brother desperately wanted to find him. Cheyenne Mesa and its staff never helped in the investigation of looking for Robert or trying to keep in contact or anything after he disappeared, despite the fact that he went missing from their watch. And technically, I would think that they should be held liable for his disappearance to some extent, but they never faced any repercussions. And it was just left to Gene to try to find him. Gene and Gerald Jr. have always hoped that Robert would come home or contact them. As months passed, I'm sure that they both hoped they'd hear from Robert eventually and kept hope that he would call. But then those months turned into years, and to this day, there has still never been another sign of Robert anywhere. It would be several years after Bobby went missing before his case was reclassified from runaway to endangered missing. While it is good that investigators eventually classified his case as endangered missing instead of runaway and acknowledged that there are just too many details in this case that don't make sense to classify him as a runaway, I'm afraid that's honestly too little too late. They hadn't done any investigation at the beginning, and when you start from zero, years into the future, it's not really helpful. Police investigations depend on the initial work that police officers do, which is why it should be encouraged that police officers treat everything as the worst case scenario until they get more evidence. If they're investigating a possible suicide, they should assume it's a murder until it's proven to be a suicide. If someone goes missing, they should assume it's the worst case scenario and then work their way back to, okay, well, none of these things seem to have happened, so I think they left of their own accord. That's how police work should be done. Cheyenne Mesa would shut down in 1997 due to financial issues. I tried to do some research on Cheyenne Mesa. I tried to look into their philosophy, their treatment methods, and if there had been any other accusations of possible abuse or anything that eventually came out about them. But when you search the Cheyenne Mesa Adolescent Treatment Facility, pretty much everything that comes up is specifically about Bobby, which is great because it keeps his name out there, but I can't really find anything about its founders, their philosophy, or their treatment methods. So I don't really know if anything happened there or if other people experienced something that Bobby may have experienced there. Eventually, Gene lost hope that Robert would ever contact them or come home, which is sadly understandable. In a 2014 interview with Kirk Mitchell of the Denver Post, Gene said this about Robert's disappearance. "There has been absolute silence. I don't understand the dead silence. If he ran away, he would have called. There is no way he would have run away without any shoes." So, according to Gene, she and Robert were on the phone during the time that the staff supposedly saw him laying in the field and running away from the facility. And you're telling me that absolutely no one at this treatment facility tried to stop a child who was in their care and that they would have been legally liable for during this time. No one tried to stop him. And even if he was too big to stop, as they claim that he was, why didn't they follow him or immediately alert the staff and call the police and just continue to follow him until the police showed up to help? But okay, let's just say that the staff got the time wrong. So sometime after the time that they claim he's laying in this field, they see him run away, they waited hours to call Gene, which just seems crazy to me. They should have been calling the parents immediately after calling authorities to let them know that their child had just run away from this facility. Because let's say that they're like, oh, we don't want to panic them. Well, listen, even if the child runs away, they're found immediately or convinced to come back immediately, you would think the next steps would be to set up a conversation between the facility, the parents, and the child to discuss this runaway issue and more action that needs to be taken and how they're going to resolve this after. No matter what, the parents need to know the kid tried to run away, right? No matter what, even if you find them, even if they come back, they need to know right away that this happened, and then they need to help plan what the next steps will be. But let's say that the kid does actually run away. So they run away from this facility. The parents would probably know information. Where could they possibly get money? Do they have any family or friends in the area they could be going to? Do they have someone that they could have called to come help them? Like, there's so much information that these parents would have that you would think that the parents would, by protocol, need to be called right after a kid goes missing. That would just make sense, right? And I think the other thing that throws me for a loop, it's actually not in my script, but it just popped into my head, is that after Bobby goes missing, this idea of like a field trip that he was supposed to be on that day never comes up again, like ever. They don't explain where he was supposed to be going, why he may not have wanted to go there, how, like, it just is never brought up again. It doesn't seem important, like nobody talks about it again. So it's like, was there even a field trip that day? Was there something he was actually going to do that day, or did they just tell her that she couldn't come see him? I never got like an answer. I never was able to find an answer about if the authorities were ever able to confirm that there was actually supposed to be a field trip that Bobby was going on that day. Because I feel like if that information were known, it would give them a direction of like, okay, maybe the staff is telling the truth, or like, no, they're just lying about every little thing, and this is crazy. So in one thing, Jean pointed out that if Robert had run away, he would have contacted her eventually. And I believe that I agree with Jean about this. And obviously I could be wrong. None of us really knows what angsty 15-year-olds are thinking, especially when they are actually dealing with true trauma and depression and just horrific things going on in their lives. But Bobby had confided in his mom before. Maybe not right away, but eventually he did. And when he'd run away previously, he'd always come back. I mean, he shared things with her. They spoke every day on the phone, so it's not like he didn't think he could reach out to her. Like, he knew she would take the phone call, that they would be able to talk. So when Jean made him promise to just hold on until she got there, I truly think that that's what Bobby intended to do. And I think that he would have known that if he had waited for her to come, she would have listened and helped in whatever way she could have. Now, even ignoring all of those red flags, let's ponder for a moment that maybe Bobby did run away. And I say this because we do know that Bobby ran away once before. But it's important to remember he was 15. So surely this 15-year-old with no shoes, no money, no personal belongings, no clothes, possibly, since his clothes were in his possessions back at Cheyenne Mesa, and no real connections to anyone in this area beyond his mother and brother, would eventually have to contact his family again or seek some sort of help where he would then be identified and possibly sent back home. So let's go out on a limb and go even one step further in talking about this. Let's say Robert did run away and he found some way to stay out on his own, and he stayed away because he was really worried that if he went back home, his mom would be forced to send him back to a treatment facility. Even if all that were possible, and I really don't think it would be, you would think that after he turned 18, he would reach out to his family again, because the authorities would have no right to tell his mother to send him somewhere, or she would lose custody because he would be an adult legally at that point. Jean has always believed that the staff members of Cheyenne Mesa knew more than they were sharing with investigators. It's hard to see that not only were they little to no help whatsoever, but that their stories were sometimes just outright lies. In my opinion, they were at the very least a hindrance to the investigation. Between their lying, the fact that they allegedly let him run off no matter what, and then that they literally threatened the mom of a child that they let run away if their stories are true, is crazy to me. That the police were like, nope, nah, y'all are good. You didn't do anything. What? Like, I cannot get over the fact that they threatened the mother of a child they supposedly lost, if their stories are true. They lost him, and they were still threatening Jean for harassment. And the cherry on top we cannot forget about is one staff member on the very first day, within hours of Bobby going missing, saying maybe Bobby didn't make it. I did mention this briefly earlier, but Jean never was able to figure out if there even was an outing on the day that Robert went missing. She doesn't know if that was actually a plan or if someone had just lied to her to keep her away from the facility long enough for them to get rid of Bobby. And I think one of the most telling signs that something happened to Bobby, not that he ran away, is that there has never been any sign of Bobby whatsoever. I don't think there's much chance that Bobby is still alive, and that just breaks my heart for Jean and Gerald Jr., who I know always wanted Bobby to come home. They've spent years searching for him, and I know they would still welcome him with open arms if he showed up today. It has been so long, 33 years. But Bobby's disappearance is still unsolved, and this is still an open case, although it is cold. Maybe you or someone you know was a patient at the Cheyenne Mesa Adolescent Treatment Center at or around the time that Bobby went missing. If you were, or if you do know any information about this facility, its staff, or even know about what may have happened to Bobby, please reach out and give the police that information. During my initial research, I couldn't find a lot about just who Robert was and what he was like. Most of what I found was about his life in relation to his trauma and his disappearance. While I was editing and looking for more pictures of Robert, I found a little card talking about Robert that I want to read to you now. More than. My name is Bobby. One of my favorite things is to eat carrots dipped in A1 sauce. Really. I used to get the biggest kick out of moving my mom's coffee cup when she would walk away for a moment. She would yell my name and then I would laugh. I was a typical boy who loved sports like skateboarding, riding bikes, and playing basketball. Now I'm a statistic, but I can tell you I am more than that. At the time of his disappearance, Robert stood at 5'9" and was about 180 pounds. He is Caucasian with brown hair and brown eyes. He was last seen in the vicinity of the 13,500 block of South 8th Street in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where the Cheyenne Mesa treatment facility was located. He wore black wire-rimmed glasses. He also has a scar on his forehead and a circular scar or some sort of discoloration on the back of his right hand. There are two age-progressed images of what Bobby may look like today if he is still alive that were created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The newest is progressed to what Robert may look like at 47 years old. If Bobby is out there today, he would be 49. It's my opinion that something did happen to Robert at the Cheyenne Mesa facility, and maybe I'm totally wrong and the staff at Cheyenne Mesa were just the freaking worst people on the planet, and they truly put a mother of a missing child through hell because they wanted to protect their own reputation. And something happened to Bobby after he ran away, but I feel like that one's a stretch. It's my opinion that someone at Cheyenne Mesa did something to Robert, and that's why he's not here. If you have any information regarding Robert's disappearance, his possible whereabouts, or what may have happened to him, please call the Colorado Springs Police Department 719-444-7000. You can also call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST. I know it's been so long since Robert went missing. 33 years is a really long time. But I do still believe that there are people out there who know what happened to Robert or can help the family find out what did happen to him. I am very hopeful that maybe one day, through the right tip coming in, or maybe even through genetic genealogy somehow, that we'll find out at the very least where Bobby is and maybe what happened to him as well. Thank you very much for watching this video about Robert, and if you made it all the way to the end, I appreciate you so much. That means so much to me, and I'm glad that you listened to Robert's whole story. And that's all I have for you for now. So stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.